October 14th, 1814, and the rain had begun to fall against the windows of Thornfield Hall as Eleanor Whitmore stood in the Dowager Duchess's sitting room for what she feared might be the last time. The chamber still smelled of lavender and old books, still held the impression of its former occupant in every cushion and carefully arranged portrait. Yet the warmth had fled from it 3 weeks past when the Dowager had drawn her final breath with Eleanor's hand clasped in hers. Now Eleanor stood in her only good dress, the black bombazine she had worn every day since the funeral, her grey eyes fixed on the man who had arrived that morning with the authority to dismantle everything she had known for 5 years. Frederick Ashworth, the Duke of Ravenscroft, stood near the fireplace with his back to the flames. And though Eleanor had heard stories of him from the Dowager across countless evenings, nothing had prepared her for the cold efficiency of his presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome, if not for the severity that hardened every line of it. His blue eyes, piercing and impatient, swept over Eleanor as though cataloguing the contents of a room he intended to empty. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that her years of service might mean something. She had managed the household accounts, overseen the charitable works, sat with the Dowager through illness and loneliness, while this grandson remained abroad tending to investments and avoiding the obligations of blood. But hope, Eleanor had learned, was a luxury she could not afford. The Duke consulted his pocket watch, a gesture that dismissed her more eloquently than words. "Your services are no longer required, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice held no cruelty, only the flat pragmatism of a man settling accounts. "The estate will be restructured. I am returning to London within the fortnight, and I see no reason to maintain staff for a house that will stand largely empty." Eleanor felt the words land like stones in her chest, but she kept her spine straight and her hands folded before her. She had learned stillness in her years of service, learned to make herself small and useful and unobtrusive. "May I ask, Your Grace, how long I have to make arrangements?" He barely glanced at her. "1 week should be sufficient. The solicitor will address any wages owed at the reading tomorrow." Outside, the October wind drove the rain harder against the glass, and Eleanor thought of her small quarters in the east wing, of the Dowager's gentle voice asking her to read aloud on winter evenings, of the children at the village school who would wonder why she no longer came. She thought of all the invisible threads that bound her to this place, and felt them beginning to fray. "Very well, Your Grace," she said quietly, and turned to leave the room with the dignity that was all she had left to her name. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel, and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The library had always been the Dowager's favorite room, and Eleanor had spent countless hours here, organizing the leather-bound volumes by subject and author, creating a system of cataloging that brought order to decades of haphazard collecting. Now she sat in a chair near the rain-streaked window on the morning of October 15th, her hands wrapped around a teacup that had long since gone cold, watching Thomas Greville arrange his papers at the great mahogany desk. The elderly solicitor had served the family for 40 years, and his kind eyes found Eleanor's with a warmth that steadied her nerves. Frederick stood by the fireplace, his impatience evident in every line of his posture, consulting his pocket watch with the same dismissive gesture he had employed the day before. Eleanor had resigned herself to the reading as a formality, a final humiliation before she packed her few belongings and sought employment elsewhere. She had already begun composing letters in her mind, reaching out to distant connections who might know of a household requiring a companion or governess. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows as Greville began to read, his voice measured and precise, detailing the distribution of the Dowager's personal effects, her jewellery to various goddaughters, her books to the village lending library Eleanor had helped establish. Eleanor listened with only partial attention until her own name cut through her reverie like a bell. To Eleanor Whitmore. Greville read, his voice warming. I leave Rose Cottage on the eastern boundary of the estate, along with an income of £50 per annum in recognition of her faithful service and genuine friendship. Furthermore, no alterations shall be made to the charitable works established during my lifetime, including the village school and the Widows' Fund, without Mrs. Whitmore's written approval, as she alone understands my intentions for their continuation. Eleanor's teacup rattled against its saucer, her hands suddenly trembling. She looked up to find Frederick staring at Greville with an expression of barely contained fury. What precisely does that mean? He demanded, his voice sharp. It means, Your Grace, Greville replied calmly, that certain estate holdings connected to these charitable endowments cannot be sold or restructured without Mrs. Whitmore's cooperation. The Dowager was quite specific in her instructions. Before Frederick could respond, the library doors burst open and a young woman swept into the room in a rustle of blue silk, her golden curls artfully arranged, her smile bright and possessive. Frederick, darling cousin, I came as soon as I heard you had arrived. Lady Beatrice Sinclair crossed to Frederick and pressed a kiss to his cheek, while her sharp eyes swept over Eleanor with undisguised contempt. Eleanor felt herself shrinking into her mourning black, her brief moment of hope already curdling into something more complicated. Beatrice's gaze lingered on the will in Greville's hands, and something calculating flickered across her lovely features. Frederick's jaw tightened as he looked from Beatrice to Eleanor, and for the first time since his arrival, Eleanor saw uncertainty in those piercing blue eyes, a crack in his cold efficiency that suggested her fate was no longer quite so simple as a one-week dismissal. Frederick's study bore the musty scent of dust motes drifting through the weak afternoon light that filtered past heavy curtains clearly untouched for years, and Eleanor stood before the massive oak desk, clutching her ledger books to her chest like a shield, as the Duke regarded her with an expression she could not quite decipher. The room spoke of masculine authority in its dark panelling and hunting prints, yet it felt hollow somehow, a space waiting for someone to claim it, and Eleanor wondered if Frederick felt as out of place here as she did. She had spent 3 hours since the will reading preparing her accounts, gathering every record of the charitable works she had managed under the Dowager's direction, determined to demonstrate that she was no scheming opportunist, but simply a woman who had done her duty well. Frederick gestured to the chair across from him with a curt nod, and she sat, arranging the ledgers on the desk between them with hands that remained admirably steady despite the rapid flutter of her pulse. I require an explanation, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice clipped, but lacking the dismissive coldness of their first encounter. My grandmother apparently entrusted you with considerable responsibility, and I find myself obligated to understand why. Eleanor opened the first ledger, turning it so he could see the neat columns of figures, the careful accounting of every penny spent on the village school, the Widows' Fund, the Christmas baskets for tenant families. She began to explain the systems she had developed, the ways she had stretched limited resources to serve more families, and as she spoke of the children who now could read and write, of the widows who no longer faced the workhouse, something shifted in her voice. The careful neutrality fell away, replaced by a warmth she could not contain, a passion for work that had given her purpose through 5 years of quiet service. Frederick leaned forward, his blue eyes focused on her face rather than the ledgers, and Eleanor felt a flush rise to her cheeks under the intensity of his scrutiny. For one moment, something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, of genuine seeing, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The door opened without warning, shattering the fragile connection, and Beatrice swept in with Mrs. Colburn trailing behind bearing a tea tray. The housekeeper's expression thunderous as she watched Beatrice settle herself on the settee as though she owned the room. "I thought you might need refreshment, cousin," Beatrice said sweetly, her eyes sliding to Eleanor with barely concealed malice. "And surely Mrs. Whitmore has duties elsewhere, rather than troubling you with tedious household matters?" Frederick's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Beatrice continued, in a carrying whisper clearly meant to be overheard. "One does wonder how a simple companion came to have such influence over dear Aunt Margaret's affairs, does one not?" Eleanor felt the words like a blade between her ribs, but she kept her chin lifted, her grey eyes steady. "Your stay is extended indefinitely," Frederick said abruptly, his gaze holding Eleanor's with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Until these matters are properly resolved, you will remain at Thornfield." The morning of October 17th dawned clear and golden, the first respite from the relentless autumn rains that had shrouded Thornfield Hall since Frederick's arrival, and Eleanor walked the familiar path to the village school with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the sunshine warming her face and everything to do with escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the great house where Beatrice's poisonous whispers seemed to follow her through every corridor. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the village, a small stone building with a slate roof and bright blue door that Eleanor had convinced the Dowager to fund 3 years ago when she discovered that the village children had nowhere to learn their letters, and as she pushed open that cheerful door to the chorus of eager voices calling her name, she felt herself become someone other than the invisible companion, the unwanted complication, the woman whose presence was merely tolerated. Young Sarah rushed forward to show Eleanor the sampler she had been stitching, her small fingers proud of the uneven letters spelling out her own name, while little William tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, demanding to demonstrate his progress with sums, and Eleanor knelt among them with genuine joy, illuminating her plain features in a way that transformed her entirely. She did not see the rider who had followed at a distance, did not notice the tall figure who dismounted at the tree line and stood watching through the schoolhouse window, his blue eyes fixed on the scene within as though witnessing something that defied his understanding of the world. Frederick had told himself he was merely surveying the estate, familiarizing himself with his holdings after years abroad, but his horse had somehow carried him to this place he had heard mentioned in the ledgers, and now he could not look away from the woman who laughed with such abandon as a child placed a crown of autumn leaves upon her dark hair. A village woman emerged from the cottage beside the school and noticed the Duke standing there, and being of the sort who believed gentry ought to know the truth of things, she approached with a curtsy and began to speak of Mrs. Whitmore without prompting, telling how the lady had saved the school when the previous vicar wanted it closed, how she had paid for slates and primers from her own meagre wages, how she visited sick children in their homes and brought soup when families could not afford food. Frederick listened in silence, his rigid worldview cracking along fault lines he had not known existed. Watching through the window as Eleanor guided a struggling boy through a difficult passage with patience that seemed inexhaustible, her grey eyes bright with purpose, her whole being radiating a vitality he had never glimpsed in the mourning-clad shadow who navigated his grandmother's halls. Something uncomfortable stirred in his chest, something he could not name and did not wish to examine. And when Eleanor glanced toward the window as though sensing his presence, Frederick stepped back into the shadows of the oaks, retreating to his horse with a confusion that would not settle, carrying with him the image of autumn leaves in dark hair and the sound of children's laughter and the dawning realization that he had gravely misjudged the woman his grandmother had loved. The dining room blazed with candlelight from the twin candelabras that graced the long mahogany table, their flames reflecting off crystal and silver in a display of elegance that only emphasized Eleanor's sense of displacement as she took her seat at the far end, separated from Frederick and Beatrice by what felt like miles of polished wood and unspoken accusations. She had spent the day avoiding both of them, unable to shake the memory of Frederick watching her from the tree line, unable to understand why he had been there or what it meant. And now Beatrice sat resplendent in emerald green silk, with diamonds glittering at her throat, holding court as though she were already mistress of Thornfield Hall. Mrs. Colburn hovered in the doorway, her weathered face creased with concern as she watched Eleanor smooth the worn fabric of her mourning dress, the same black gown she had worn for 4 days now, because she owned nothing else suitable for dining with a duke. The first courses passed in strained silence, broken only by Beatrice's brittle commentary on London society. But Eleanor felt Frederick's gaze returning to her again and again, felt the weight of questions he seemed to be gathering like ammunition. It was over the roast pheasant that Beatrice struck, her voice carrying the false sweetness of poisoned honey as she remarked how curious it was that dear Aunt Margaret had become so dependent on her companion in her final years. How convenient that such dependency had resulted in such generous provisions in the will. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her fork, the thin gold band of her wedding ring catching the candlelight, and she waited for Frederick to join his cousin's insinuation, to complete her humiliation in this room where she had once shared quiet suppers with the dowager who had treated her like a daughter. But Frederick's voice cut through the silence with unexpected sharpness, demanding to know what exactly Beatrice meant by her implications, and suddenly Eleanor found herself pinned by those piercing blue eyes that demanded truth. She could have deflected, could have retreated into the invisibility that had protected her for so long, but something in his gaze stripped away her defenses, and she heard herself speaking of Charles Whitmore, her late husband, the charming second son who had courted her with poetry and promises before revealing himself as a wastrel and a gambler who had left her buried beneath a mountain of debt that took 2 years of her wages to clear. She spoke of selling everything she owned, of the creditors who had hounded her until the dowager had offered sanctuary, of the wedding ring she still wore not from sentiment, but as armor against the pity of others. The words fell into silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the candle flames guttering, could see Beatrice's triumphant expression faltering into uncertainty, could watch the shame spread across Frederick's features as he realized how thoroughly he had misjudged her. Mrs. Colburn pressed a hand to her heart in the doorway, and Eleanor felt tears threatening behind her eyes, felt the terrible vulnerability of having exposed her wounds to people who might use them against her. Yet when Frederick spoke her name with something like reverence in his voice, she understood that everything between them had irrevocably changed. The morning of October 19th found Eleanor in the dowager's rose garden, seated upon the cold stone bench where her beloved employer had spent countless hours in contemplation, the last blooms of autumn hanging heavy on their stems with petals bruised by frost and ready to fall at the slightest touch, and she had come here to make a decision that had kept her sleepless through the long night hours, turning over the memory of her confession at dinner and the way Frederick's face had transformed from accusation to something she dared not name. She was considering leaving. Despite the cottage promised in the will, despite the school that needed her, because the weight of Beatrice's campaign and her own exposed vulnerability had become unbearable, and she could not spend another day in a house where her wounds had been laid bare for examination by those who might use them as weapons. The crunch of boots on the gravel path made her stiffen, and she did not turn even when she recognized Frederick's tall shadow falling across the dying roses, even when he cleared his throat with an uncertainty she had never heard from him before. He asked if he might sit, his voice stripped of its usual command, and when she nodded without speaking, he lowered himself onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the October chill. And for a long moment neither spoke, while the wind scattered crimson petals across the path like drops of blood. When Frederick finally broke the silence, his words came haltingly, as though each one cost him something precious. And he spoke of a woman named Arabella, who had courted him 3 years ago with declarations of love that had seemed genuine until he discovered she had been simultaneously negotiating with his solicitors about the precise terms of her marriage settlement, caring nothing for him beyond the fortune and title he represented. He told Eleanor that Arabella's betrayal had calcified something within him, had taught him to see mercenary motives behind every kindness, and that when he arrived at Thornfield to find a woman ensconced in his grandmother's household with provisions made in the will, he had assumed the worst, because assuming the worst had become his only protection against being fooled again. His hands were restless as he spoke, those capable fingers that Eleanor had noticed despite herself, and when he turned to face her, his blue eyes held none of their usual frost, only a raw remorse that made her breath catch in her throat. He said he had been wrong about her, utterly and unforgivably wrong, and that her dignity in the face of his accusations had shamed him more than any rebuke could have done. And then his hand reached toward hers where it rested on the cold stone, his fingers brushing against hers with a gentleness that sent warmth flooding through her despite the autumn chill. He asked her to stay, not as an obligation or a business arrangement, but because he wished to know the grandmother he had neglected through the eyes of the woman who had loved her, and Eleanor felt the tears she had been fighting gather in her grey eyes as she whispered that she would stay, feeling something fragile and frightening, taking root in the space between them where their hands nearly touched. The afternoon of October 21st arrived wrapped in grey mist and steady rain that streaked the library windows and made the fire in the great stone hearth seem all the more precious, its amber light casting dancing shadows across the walls of books that Eleanor had organized and loved for 5 years. And she sat now in the leather chair that had been the Dowager's favorite, while Frederick occupied its twin across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched when either shifted position. And between them on the small table lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon that Eleanor had retrieved from the rosewood box in her chambers, where she kept the few treasures of her years at Thornfield Hall. Neither of them had mentioned that this was the 7th day, that by Frederick's original decree she should have been gone by now with her modest trunk packed and her future uncertain. And the silence on that subject felt like a shared secret, an unspoken agreement that something had changed between them that made such calculations irrelevant. Frederick held one of the letters in his hands, his grandmother's elegant script flowing across yellowed paper, and Eleanor watched his face as he read words written 10 years ago when he had been a young man of 22 making his first journey abroad. Words that spoke of pride and love and a grandmother's fierce hope for the grandson who carried her late husband's eyes. She saw the moment when understanding struck him, saw the way his throat moved as he swallowed against emotion, saw the slight tremor in those capable hands that had touched hers so briefly in the garden 2 days before. He looked up, and his blue eyes were no longer piercing but raw, and he asked why his grandmother had never sent these letters, why she had written of her love, and then locked the words away unsent, and Eleanor told him gently that the Dowager had feared rejection, had feared that her ambitious grandson would find her sentimentality tiresome, had chosen to love him silently rather than risk having that love dismissed. The fire crackled and popped in the silence that followed, and Frederick's voice was rough when he spoke again, confessing that he had written to her perhaps 6 times in 10 years, brief business-like reports that gave nothing of himself, and that he had told himself she would not want to be troubled with his concerns, when the truth was he had been too proud to admit he was lonely, too armored to reach across the distance for the comfort she would have freely given. Eleanor found herself leaning toward him, her hand extending of its own accord to rest upon his arm, and she felt the warmth of him through the fine wool of his coat as she told him that the Dowager had kept every one of those letters in her bedside drawer, that she had read them so often the paper had grown soft as cloth, that she had died knowing her grandson loved her even if he had never found the words to say it. Their eyes held, and the rain whispered against the windows, and the space between them seemed to shrink until Eleanor could see the gold flecks in his blue irises, could feel the moment building toward something inevitable. And then the library door burst open, and Beatrice swept in with triumph blazing in her smile, announcing that the carriages from London had arrived. The evening of October 23rd found Thornfield Hall transformed into something Eleanor barely recognized, its corridors blazing with candles that cast dancing shadows across silk wallpaper and polished floors, its drawing-room filled with the rustle of expensive fabrics and the tinkling laughter of women who had never known a moment of uncertainty about their place in the world, and Eleanor stood near the doorway in her only evening dress of modest grey silk, watching the spectacle unfold while feeling herself fade into invisibility with each passing moment. Beatrice had worked swiftly in the 2 days since the London carriages arrived, filling the house with 4 eligible young ladies and their ambitious mothers, with gentlemen seeking sport and gossip, with all the glittering machinery of society that existed to remind women like Eleanor exactly where they did not belong. The pianoforte sang beneath the fingers of Lady Sophia Montague, a golden-haired beauty of perhaps 20 years, whose dowry was rumoured to exceed £30,000, and whose tinkling laugh seemed designed to draw Frederick's attention across the crowded room. And Eleanor watched him stand beside her at the instrument, his dark head inclined toward her fair one, and felt something sharp twist beneath her ribs that she refused to name as jealousy. She had been given no choice but to serve as hostess by necessity, for Mrs. Colborne had whispered urgently that someone must manage the household arrangements, and Beatrice could not be troubled with such mundane concerns as bedroom assignments and dinner menus, and so Eleanor moved through the evening like a ghost, ensuring wine-glass were filled and fires were stoked, while the London ladies looked through her as though she were part of the furniture. Frederick's eyes found hers twice across the crowded room, and each time she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch, a frustration that mirrored her own, a longing that seemed to reach across the space between them, but then someone would claim his attention, and Eleanor would turn away, reminding herself that the intimacy of the library had been an illusion born of firelight and shared grief. It was during the second course of dinner that Lord Philip Hastings appeared at her elbow, a gentleman of perhaps 45 years, with kind brown eyes and silver threading through his dark hair, and when he asked if she might do him the honour of sitting beside him, Eleanor startled so visibly that Mrs. Colborne, watching from the doorway, pressed a hand to her heart. Lord Hastings spoke to her as though she were a person worthy of conversation rather than a servant to be overlooked, asking about the school she ran, about the late dowager whom he had known and admired, about her thoughts on matters that no one had sought her opinion on in years, and across the table Eleanor felt the weight of Frederick's gaze upon them, felt the sudden tension radiating from his rigid posture as he watched another man offer her the attention and respect that society said she did not deserve. And she wondered if she had imagined the connection growing between them, or if it had been real and was now being buried beneath the avalanche of eligible beauty that Beatrice had so cleverly arranged. The midnight hour of October 24th found Eleanor descending the servants' staircase with a single candle clutched in trembling fingers, her dark hair unbound and falling past her shoulders in waves she had not troubled to braid, her feet bare beneath the hem of her worn dressing gown because sleep had proven impossible, and the walls of her small chamber had seemed to press closer with each passing hour until she could not breathe for thinking of Frederick standing beside Lady Sophia at the pianoforte, his dark head inclined toward her golden curls, his attention claimed by beauty and breeding and everything Eleanor was not, The library called to her as it always did in moments of distress, promising the comfort of familiar books and the lingering presence of the dowager who had loved this room. And Eleanor pushed open the heavy oak door, expecting solitude, only to find Frederick standing before the dying fire in his shirt-sleeves, his cravat abandoned, his dark hair disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. And when he turned at her soft gasp, his blue eyes widened at the sight of her, informal and vulnerable in ways she had never allowed him to see. They stood frozen for a moment that stretched between them like spun glass, fragile and shimmering with possibility. And then Frederick spoke her name in a voice roughened by something that sounded almost like relief, and Eleanor found herself stepping into the room rather than fleeing as propriety demanded. He confessed that he could not sleep for the chatter echoing in his head, the endless scheming and matchmaking and expectations that had followed him from London like a plague. And Eleanor surprised herself by admitting that she had once dreamed of more than survival, had once believed she might have a life filled with purpose and perhaps even love before her husband's debts and death had taught her that dreams were luxuries she could not afford. Frederick moved closer as she spoke, drawn by her honesty as a moth to flame, and Eleanor watched the firelight play across features that had softened in these midnight hours into something approaching tenderness, something that made her heart beat faster, even as her mind whispered warnings about the foolishness of hoping. He asked what she had dreamed of, this woman who managed estates and taught children and made herself indispensable while expecting nothing, and Eleanor found herself telling him about the girl she had been at 17, full of romantic notions and literary ambitions, before reality had carved away everything soft and left only the practical creature who stood before him now. The space between them had narrowed without her noticing, until she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could smell sandalwood, and something uniquely him, could feel the warmth radiating from his body as his hand rose slowly toward her face, and Eleanor's breath caught as his fingertips brushed her cheek with devastating gentleness, as his head lowered toward hers, as the moment trembled on the edge of something irreversible, and then the clock began striking 1, and footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond, and they sprang apart like guilty children. But not before Eleanor saw in his eyes a promise that this was not over, that whatever had kindled between them in this midnight library would not be so easily extinguished. The afternoon of October 25th arrived wrapped in autumn's fading glory, the gardens of Thornfield Hall ablaze with chrysanthemums in shades of gold and copper, while dying leaves drifted across the gravel paths like whispered secrets, and Eleanor walked beside Lord Philip Hastings, with her hands clasped before her and her mind spinning with confusion, because Frederick had not spoken to her once since their midnight encounter in the library, had avoided her gaze at breakfast, had turned away when she entered rooms, as though the almost kiss they had shared was something shameful to be forgotten rather than treasured. Lord Hastings was speaking of his estate some 10 miles distant, of the library he had built for his late wife, who had loved books as Eleanor did, of the quiet life he led now that his children were grown and married. And Eleanor tried to attend to his words, because he was diamond and genuine, and looked at her as though she were worthy of attention. But her treacherous heart kept pulling her gaze toward the windows of Thornfield Hall, where she imagined Frederick watching, though she told herself she was foolish to hope he cared enough to look. She did not know that Frederick stood at his study window with his hands clenched so tightly on the sill that his knuckles had gone white, watching every step Lord Hastings took beside her, every inclination of the older man's head toward hers, every smile that crossed Eleanor's face in response to whatever pleasant things this respectable widower was saying, and that something dark and desperate was clawing at his chest because he had spent the morning listening to Beatrice extol the virtues of Lady Sophia Montague while his thoughts remained fixed on grey eyes and dark hair, and the way Eleanor had trembled when his fingers brushed her cheek. Lord Hastings stopped beneath an ancient oak whose leaves had turned to flame, and Eleanor stopped beside him. And when he turned to face her with earnest kindness in his brown eyes, she knew, before he spoke what words were coming, knew that this good man was about to offer her something she had never expected to receive again, the chance at respectability and companionship, and perhaps even contentment with someone who saw her value clearly. He spoke of admiration grown over the years of their acquaintance through the Dowager, of loneliness that matched her own, of a courtship conducted properly if she would permit him the honor, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes because Lord Hastings was offering her everything sensible and nothing she truly wanted, and she could not accept, yet could not quite refuse. So she asked for time to consider, and watched relief and hope war across his weathered features. From the window above, Frederick watched Lord Hastings bow over Eleanor's hand, watched her grey skirts disappear around the hedge as they continued walking, and heard Beatrice's voice behind him suggesting that now would be the perfect moment to announce his intentions toward Lady Sophia, and his jaw tightened with a fury he could barely contain because Eleanor was slipping away and pride was strangling every word he needed to say. The evening of October 26th had stretched interminably through dinner, through stilted conversation and Beatrice's pointed remarks about Lady Sophia's accomplishments and Lord Hastings' gentle inquiries about Eleanor's well-being, and now at 9 o'clock, Eleanor fled toward her chambers in the east wing, with her heart pounding against her ribs, because she could not endure another moment of watching Frederick laugh at something Lady Sophia whispered, could not bear the careful blankness of his expression whenever their eyes accidentally met, could not reconcile the man who had almost kissed her in the midnight library with this distant stranger who seemed determined to pretend she did not exist, and she was so lost in her anguish that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a hand closed around her elbow and spun her around, and suddenly Frederick was there in the dim hallway with his cravat loosened and his blue eyes blazing with something that looked almost like fury, demanding to know if she intended to accept Hastings, if she planned to leave Thornfield, and marry a man she barely knew simply to escape. And Eleanor stared at him with her grey eyes wide and her dark hair escaping its pins, because she could not comprehend what right he had to ask her anything when he had spent 2 days treating her as though their moment in the library had been nothing more than a fever dream, and the anger that rose in her chest was a relief after so many hours of quiet suffering. She asked him what possible concern it could be of his, whether she married Lord Hastings or anyone else, when he had made his preferences perfectly clear by dancing attendance on Lady Sophia and ignoring the woman he had nearly kissed, and Frederick's jaw tightened as he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and see the muscle jumping in his cheek, and his voice emerged rough and raw as he told her that he had ignored her because he could not trust himself to be near her without touching her, without pulling her into his arms and scandalizing every gossip in residence, without declaring to the entire assembled company that Eleanor Whitmore was the only woman in that house worth a moment of his attention. Eleanor's breath caught at his words, at the desperate honesty she could hear beneath the anger, and her own fury gentled into something more dangerous, as she admitted that she had stayed at Thornfield, not because of the cottage or the will or the charitable works, but because of him, because something had shifted between them in the rose garden and the library, and all the small moments since, and Frederick made a sound low in his throat that might have been relief or triumph or prayer as his hands came up to grip her arms through the thin grey silk of her gown, holding her as though she might vanish if he loosened his grasp. And the distant sound of laughter from the drawing-room faded to nothing as they stood together in that shadowed hallway, with truth finally spoken between them. Frederick's hand slid from Eleanor's arms to cradle her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones where tears had begun to trace silver paths through the faint dust of the hallway's shadows. And his voice, when he spoke again, had lost all trace of anger and emerged instead hoarse and broken with an emotion Eleanor had never expected to hear directed at her, telling her that he loved her, that he had been fighting this feeling since the moment she defended herself at dinner with such quiet dignity, since he watched her teaching children in the schoolhouse with sunlight turning her plain features luminous, since she shared his grandmother's letters and made him understand what he had lost through his own stubborn absence. And Eleanor trembled beneath his touch, because these were words she had stopped believing she would ever hear, words her late husband had never spoken with any sincerity. Words that society had taught her were not meant for women like her, with grey eyes instead of blue and ordinary features instead of beauty and a widow's weeds instead of a dowry. And she wanted desperately to believe them, but 5 years of invisibility and a marriage built on charming lies had carved wounds too deep to heal with a single declaration in a darkened corridor. She told him that she was afraid, that men had made her promises before and broken them as easily as breathing, that she could not survive being chosen in passion and discarded in daylight when reason returned. And Frederick made a sound of anguish as he pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them, as he swore that this was not impulse, that he had spent 12 days fighting what he knew in his bones to be true because he feared she would never want a man who had treated her so coldly at their first meeting, a man whose broken engagement had left him suspicious and cruel, but that he could not watch her walk into Lord Hastings' life without telling her that his own heart would shatter if she left. Eleanor's fingers rose of their own accord to rest against his chest, where she could feel the rapid thundering of his heart beneath her palm, proof that this composed and distant duke was as undone as she, and she whispered that she needed time to believe him, time to trust that mourning would not bring regret, and society's whispers would not poison what grew between them in shadows. And Frederick nodded against her forehead, his hand still cradling her face as though she were something precious and fragile and worth protecting, promising that he would prove himself to her in whatever way she required, that he would court her properly if she wished, or quietly if she preferred, that he would send every London lady home and dismiss Beatrice's machinations and spend whatever time remained to them at Thornfield, showing her that she was the only woman he wanted. The distant echo of Lady Sophia's bright laugh drifted down the corridor from the drawing-room, a reminder that the world beyond this hallway still existed and still expected Frederick to choose appropriately, and Eleanor stepped back, just as footsteps sounded on the stair, but not before she saw Mrs. Colborne's familiar figure pause at the corridor's end, glimpse them standing close with tears on Eleanor's cheeks and desperate tenderness on Frederick's face, and retreat with a small smile that spoke of hope and discretion and the loyalty of a woman who had watched Eleanor suffer invisibility for far too long. The afternoon tea on October 28th unfolded in the drawing-room, with autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting golden patterns across the Aubusson carpet, where Beatrice had arranged her London guests in careful tableau. Lady Sophia Montague, resplendent in rose-pink silk, beside the pianoforte, and the Honourable Miss Chambers perched on the settee with her mother, while Lord Hastings stood near the fireplace, watching Eleanor with gentle concern in his weathered face. And Eleanor herself occupied her customary invisible position near the tea service, where she had spent 2 days pouring cups and passing plates, while her heart held Frederick's whispered promises like fragile glass that might shatter at any moment. And she watched him now, seated across the room with Beatrice at his elbow, searching his composed features for any sign that their hallway confession had been real rather than fever dream, any indication that the man who had cradled her face and sworn his love had not vanished with the morning light. And when their eyes met briefly over Lady Sophia's golden head, She saw something fierce and tender flicker in his blue gaze, before Beatrice reclaimed his attention with a tinkling laugh and a comment about household economies. And then Beatrice's voice rose with deliberate clarity as she remarked to Lady Sophia that it was such a peculiar arrangement having a paid companion serve as hostess, when surely someone of proper breeding ought to manage such duties. And the London ladies exchanged knowing glances, while Eleanor's cheeks burned and her hands trembled on the teapot. And Beatrice continued with poisonous sweetness that poor dear Mrs. Whitmore had been terribly useful to the Dowager, but one did wonder what possible role she imagined for herself, now that proper family had returned to Thornfield, and the silence that followed pressed against Eleanor's chest like a physical weight as she waited for Frederick to look away, to let the moment pass, to choose his cousin and his status and the appropriate path that society had laid before him. But instead, Frederick rose from his chair with a movement so sudden that his teacup rattled in its saucer, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of generations and the cold fury of a man who had watched something precious be threatened, declaring that Mrs. Whitmore was not a paid companion, but the woman who had managed this estate with more intelligence and dedication than any steward he had encountered in all his years abroad, that she had been his grandmother's most trusted friend, and was now his own most valued adviser, and that anyone who offered her discourtesy offered discourtesy to him personally, as Duke of Ravenscroft. And the room fell utterly silent, as Beatrice's face drained of colour, and Lady Sophia's perfect lips parted in shock, and Lord Hastings smiled quietly into his teacup. And across the suddenly charged space, Frederick's eyes found Eleanor's with an expression that spoke more eloquently than any whispered declaration in a darkened hallway, a look that said he had chosen, and would go on choosing her regardless of consequence. And Eleanor felt something shift and settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. The London guests departed Thornfield Hall on October 29th in a flurry of hastily packed trunks and thin-lipped farewells. Lady Sophia Montague's beautiful face pinched with humiliation as her mother handed her into their carriage, without a backward glance at the Duke, who had so thoroughly embarrassed them by championing a widow of no consequence over her daughter's obvious charms. And Beatrice stood on the front steps, watching the procession of carriages wind down the drive with an expression that promised retribution, her emerald travelling costume bright against the grey morning, as she announced to Frederick that she would be returning to London herself, since clearly her assistance in finding him a suitable wife was neither wanted nor appreciated, and Frederick merely inclined his head with perfect aristocratic courtesy, and wished her safe travels while Eleanor watched from the library window above, her heart still trembling with the aftershocks of yesterday's public declaration, scarcely able to believe that this cold and distant Duke had stood before the cream of London society and proclaimed her his most valued adviser. And when Frederick found her there an hour later, with the house finally emptied of poisonous guests and scheming cousins, he crossed the room with purpose in every stride, and took her hands in his own, telling her that he hoped she understood what he had meant by those words, that valued adviser was the most he could say in company, but that she must know he meant so much more. And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she confessed that she had spent the past 2 days waiting for him to remember himself, to realize that defending her publicly would cost him the good opinion of his peers. But Frederick shook his head and lifted her hands to press kisses against her knuckles, one after another, as he told her that the good opinion of people who would slight a woman of her worth was not something he had any interest in keeping. That his grandmother had written in her letters about the hollowness of society and the importance of surrounding oneself with genuine hearts rather than glittering facades, and that he had finally understood what she meant. And Eleanor laughed through her tears and told him that the Dowager would have thoroughly approved of his performance at tea, that she could almost hear the old woman cackling with delight at Beatrice's expression when Frederick rose to Eleanor's defence, and this shared memory of the woman they had both loved in different ways drew them closer until Frederick's arms wrapped around her and Eleanor pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the scent of him, sandalwood and clean linen and something uniquely his own, and they stood there in the library where everything had truly begun. Surrounded by books the Dowager had loved and Eleanor had organized, while autumn rain began to tap against the windows and the fire crackled low in the grate, and Frederick murmured against her hair that he wanted to court her properly now that the house was their own again, wanted to show her every day that his feelings were constant and true, and Eleanor lifted her face to meet his blue eyes and told him that she was beginning to believe him, that yesterday had cracked something open in her chest that had been sealed shut since her husband's betrayal, and when Frederick lowered his head and brushed his lips against her forehead with infinite tenderness, Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself hope for the first time in years that perhaps she had finally been chosen by someone worthy of the word. The days that followed October 29th unfolded with a gentleness Eleanor had never before experienced. A careful courtship conducted in the quiet spaces of Thornfield Hall, where Frederick sought her out each morning with some new excuse to spend time in her company, whether to review the estate accounts that she knew better than any steward, or to walk the grounds that his grandmother had loved, or simply to sit beside her in the library while rain streaked the windows and the fire burned low, and Eleanor found herself learning the texture of his laughter when she made some dry observation about the departed London guests, found herself memorizing the way his blue eyes softened when he looked at her across the breakfast table, where they now sat together without the barrier of formal distance. And on the morning of November the 2nd, he arrived at the schoolhouse in the village where she taught her lessons to young Sarah and little William and the dozen other children whose futures the Dowager had cared about enough to fund. And Eleanor felt her heart stumble in her chest when she saw him standing in the doorway with autumn sunshine gilding his dark hair, watching her with an expression of such open admiration that several of the older girls giggled and whispered behind their slates. And after the lessons ended, Frederick walked her back through the village, where shopkeepers and farmers called greetings to her by name, and looked at the Duke beside her with curious speculation that would surely become gossip by nightfall. But Frederick seemed unconcerned as he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and told her that he had written to his solicitor in London about the arrangements he wished to make, that he wanted to ensure the school's funding would continue regardless of what the future held. And Eleanor asked him what he meant by regardless, and Frederick stopped walking in the middle of the lane, with villagers passing around them like water around a stone, and told her that he meant he wanted her to know she would never again have to fear for her security or her purpose, that whether she chose him or not, she would always have a home at Thornfield and a school to run, and children who needed her particular brand of fierce intelligence and tender patience. And Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as she realized that this man, who had once given her 7 days to leave, was now offering her forever without conditions, was proving his love not through grand declarations, but through the practical kindness of ensuring she would never again be at the mercy of anyone's whim, and when she asked him why he would do such a thing if she might still refuse him, Frederick lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her fingers right there in the village lane with old Mrs. Grayson watching from her cottage window and the blacksmith pausing in his doorway to stare. And Frederick said that he did it because she had taught him through her example that love meant wanting someone's happiness more than your own possession of them, and Eleanor laughed through her tears and told him that he was making it terribly difficult for her to maintain her sensible caution when he insisted on being so unaccessibly wonderful. The evening of November 5th brought frost to Thornfield Hall for the first time that autumn, and Eleanor stood at her window watching the gardens transform into silver beneath the rising moon, while her heart beat with an anticipation she had long since taught herself to suppress. For Frederick had asked her that morning if she would join him for dinner in the small dining room rather than the formal one where they had taken their meals since the guests departed. and the intimacy implied in that request had stolen her breath and left her fumbling for words until she managed a simple yes that made his blue eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like joy. And now she smoothed her grey silk dress with trembling hands and wondered if she was foolish to have spent extra time arranging her dark hair. Foolish to have asked Mrs. Colburn for the small pearl earrings the Dowager had given her last Christmas. Foolish to hope that tonight might be the night when words became something more permanent. But when she descended the stairs and found Frederick waiting at the bottom with a single autumn rose in his hand and an expression of such tender nervousness that it transformed his stern features entirely, Eleanor felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. And he offered her his arm and led her to the small dining room where candles flickered on every surface and a fire blazed in the hearth, and the table was set for two with the Dowager's best china that Eleanor had so carefully catalogued in those first lonely weeks after her death. And Frederick held her chair and poured her wine, and they spoke of small things at first, the school and the estate, and the letter from Thomas Greville confirming the legal arrangements Frederick had made to secure her future. But as the meal progressed, and the wine warmed her blood, and the candlelight softened the space between them, Frederick grew quiet in a way that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. And finally he set down his glass and reached across the table to take her hand, and told her that he had something to ask her. Something he had been wanting to ask since the morning he watched her teaching children in a village schoolhouse, and realized that everything he thought he knew about worth and value and love had been terribly wrong. And Eleanor felt tears gathering in her grey eyes as Frederick rose from his chair and came around the table to kneel beside her, his blue eyes bright with emotion as he asked if she would do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife. And Eleanor thought of all the years she had spent invisible, all the years she had accepted that women like her did not get chosen, all the years she had watched from the edges of ballrooms and drawing rooms while others danced and laughed and loved. And she looked down at this proud duke kneeling before her with his heart in his eyes, and she said yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. And Frederick rose and pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly for the first time, and Eleanor melted into him with 27 years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of his embrace, while outside the frost continued to silver the gardens, and inside the fire crackled and the candles guttered, and two people who had been so very alone finally found their way home to each other. The news of the Duke of Ravenscroft's engagement to the Dowager's former companion spread through the county like wildfire in the days following November 5th, carried on the whispers of servants and the scandalized gasps of society matrons who declared it the most shocking misalliance of the season, and Eleanor found herself the subject of more attention than she had received in her entire 27 years of existence, though now the attention came tinged with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect rather than the dismissive invisibility she had grown accustomed to, and Frederick seemed entirely unconcerned by the gossip that reached them through letters from London and the pointed silence of certain neighbours who declined to call, instead focusing his considerable energy on planning a wedding that would take place before Christmas in the small chapel at Thornfield, where his grandmother had been married some 60 years before, and Eleanor spent her mornings still teaching at the village school, where young Sarah and little William greeted the news of her impending marriage with the uncomplicated joy of children who simply wanted their beloved teacher to be happy, and her afternoons walking the frost-touched gardens with Frederick, while they discussed the future of the estate and the expansion of the school and the charitable works that Eleanor would now oversee, not as a dependent companion, but as the Duchess of Ravenscroft, a title that still felt foreign on her tongue when she whispered it to herself in the privacy of her chamber. And on the morning of November the 12th, a letter arrived from Lady Beatrice Sinclair, who had retreated to London in fury after Frederick's proposal became known, a letter filled with veiled threats about society's memory and the doors that would be closed to a duke who married so far beneath him. And Eleanor's hands trembled as she read it until Frederick gently took the paper from her fingers and fed it to the library fire without reading past the first line, telling her that his cousin's opinions meant less than nothing to him, and that any door closed to his wife was a door he had no wish to enter. And Eleanor felt tears prick her grey eyes at the fierce protectiveness in his voice, at the way he said his wife as though the words were a vow he had already made in his heart. And later that day, Thomas Greville arrived with documents for Frederick to sign, and found them sitting together on the library sofa, with Eleanor's head resting against Frederick's shoulder while he read aloud from one of his grandmother's favourite novels. And the elderly solicitor smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had watched a story unfold exactly as he had hoped, telling them both that the Dowager would have been pleased beyond measure to see her beloved grandson and her treasured companion find such happiness together. And Frederick's arm tightened around Eleanor as he said that he only wished his grandmother had lived to see it, and Eleanor pressed a kiss to his shoulder and told him that she believed the Dowager knew that somehow in whatever realm existed beyond this one, the woman who had given Eleanor purpose and dignity and hope was watching and smiling, and finally at peace, knowing that the two people she had loved most in the world had found their way to each other through the grief of losing her. The wedding of Frederick Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, to Eleanor Whitmore took place on the morning of December 18th, 1814, in the small stone chapel at Thornfield Hall, where generations of Ashworths had spoken their vows, and Eleanor stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Colburn had insisted on ordering from London, despite Eleanor's protests that something simpler would suffice. And as Frederick took her trembling hands in his steady ones and spoke the words that would bind them together for all their remaining days, Eleanor felt the last remnants of the invisible woman she had been dissolving like morning frost beneath the winter sun that streamed through the chapel's ancient windows, and the pews were filled not with the glittering society figures who had whispered about the scandal of the match, but with the people who had known and loved Eleanor during her years at Thornfield, the village families whose children she taught, Thomas Greville dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, Mrs. Colburn weeping openly in the front row, and young Sarah and little William from the school serving as flower-bearers with such solemn pride that Eleanor had to blink back tears of her own. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Frederick kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weaken, a cheer rose from the assembled villagers that would have scandalized any proper London congregation, but filled the chapel with a warmth that no amount of aristocratic approval could have matched. And afterward there was a wedding breakfast in the great hall, where the long tables groaned with food, and the servants who had become Eleanor's family over 5 years raised glasses to toast the new Duchess, and Frederick kept her hand clasped in his throughout the meal, as though afraid she might vanish if he released her. And when the celebrations finally wound down, and the guests departed, and the winter darkness settled over Thornfield Hall, Frederick led Eleanor up the grand staircase to the ducal chambers that had been prepared for them, and he paused at the threshold, and looked down at her with those piercing blue eyes that had once seemed so cold, and were now filled with such warmth that Eleanor felt she might weep from the sheer impossibility of finding herself here in this moment with this man who saw her and chose her and loved her. And Frederick told her that he had spent years building walls around his heart, and she had dismantled them so gently he had not even realized they were falling until he found himself standing in their ruins completely defenseless against her. And Eleanor reached up to touch his face, and told him that she had spent years believing she was meant to be overlooked, and he had seen her when no one else did. And that gift was worth more than any title or estate or fortune he could offer. And Frederick lifted her into his arms and carried her across the threshold, and the door closed behind them on the world that had once deemed them both unworthy of love. leaving only the warmth of the fire and the softness of candlelight and two hearts that had finally found their way homes. The months that followed their wedding night unfolded like pages from a book Eleanor had never dared to imagine herself inhabiting. And as winter settled over Thornfield Hall, with its crystalline frosts and early darkness, she found herself transformed in ways both visible and invisible, no longer the grey shadow who moved through rooms unnoticed, but the Duchess of Ravenscroft, whose opinions were sought and whose presence commanded attention. And Frederick proved himself a devoted husband in countless small ways that mattered more to Eleanor than any grand gesture could have. The way he reached for her hand during quiet evenings by the fire, the way he asked her thoughts on estate matters and listened with genuine interest to her answers, the way he looked at her across crowded rooms with those blue eyes that had once seemed so cold and now held such warmth that Eleanor sometimes had to look away lest she weep from the overwhelming reality of being so thoroughly seen and wanted. And by February, the London gossip had begun to shift from scandal to grudging acceptance, as word spread that the Duke of Ravenscroft seemed genuinely besotted with his unconventional bride, and Eleanor received her first invitations to society events, though she declined most of them in favour of remaining at Thornfield, where her school continued to thrive, and where the life she and Frederick were building together felt more real than any ballroom triumph could. And on a morning in early March, when the first snowdrops were pushing through the frozen ground in the garden, where Frederick had once apologized to her beneath the fading roses, Eleanor woke to a certainty that had been growing within her for weeks, a suspicion that became confirmed when the physician arrived from the village and examined her with kind efficiency before pronouncing what she had already known in her heart, that she was with child. And Eleanor sat very still after the physician departed, her hands pressed to her still flat stomach, tears streaming down her cheeks as she contemplated the miracle of carrying Frederick's heir, the continuation of the Ashworth line that would grow within her body as proof of their love. And when Frederick returned from his morning ride and found her sitting in the window seat of their chambers with that particular expression on her face, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt before her and took her hands in his and asked what was wrong with such fear in his voice that Eleanor almost laughed through her tears as she lifted his hand and pressed it to her belly and watched his face transform from worry to confusion to dawning wonder as understanding broke across his features like sunrise. And Frederick gathered her into his arms with such trembling tenderness that Eleanor felt her heart might burst from the sheer impossibility of this life she had stumbled into, this love she had never expected, this family they were creating together in the house where she had once believed herself destined to remain forever invisible. And Frederick whispered against her hair that she had given him everything, his grandmother's memory restored, his heart awakened, his future filled with hope, and now a child to carry forward all they had built. And Eleanor held him close and thanked whatever Providence had brought a cold duke to Thornfield Hall on an October afternoon with a 1-week notice that had somehow become a lifetime. The summer of 1815 arrived at Thornfield Hall with roses blooming in profusion along the garden walls and the promise of new life swelling within Eleanor's body. And on a warm afternoon in late July, when the windows stood open to catch whatever breeze might stir the heavy air, Eleanor brought their daughter into the world with Frederick pacing the corridor outside their chambers, despite Mrs. Colborne's repeated assurances that all was progressing as it should. And when the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, and Frederick was permitted to enter, he crossed the room with such trembling reverence that Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she watched this man who had once dismissed her with a 1-week notice now gazing upon their child as though she had handed him the very stars from the sky, and they named her Catherine after Frederick's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess whose death had brought them together, and whose love had shaped them both in ways they were only beginning to understand. And little Catherine grew into a child of remarkable spirit, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's thoughtful nature. And Eleanor watched her daughter toddle through the halls of Thornfield Hall with the absolute certainty that she belonged there, a confidence Eleanor herself had never possessed until Frederick had seen past her invisibility and chosen her above all others. And the years that followed brought more children, a son named William, who inherited his mother's love of books and his father's determination, and another daughter named Rose, who filled the house with laughter and mischief. And Eleanor found herself transformed into the mistress of a great estate, the beloved wife of a duke, the mother of 3 beautiful children, a woman so far removed from the grieving widow in mourning black who had stood in the dowager's sitting room awaiting dismissal that she sometimes caught glimpses of herself in mirrors and marveled at the stranger who looked back with such contentment in her grey eyes. And Frederick never ceased in his devotion, never allowed a day to pass without some gesture that reminded Eleanor she was seen and cherished and wanted. And the village school continued to thrive under Eleanor's guidance, with young Sarah and little William now grown into teachers themselves who carried forward the legacy she had built. And Thomas Greville lived long enough to see Catherine take her first steps, and declared with tears in his rheumy eyes that the dowager would have been so proud of the family her final wishes had helped create. And Mrs. Colburn ruled the household with gentle efficiency and spoiled the children shamelessly, and never let anyone forget that she had known from the very beginning that the Duke and the companion were meant for each other. And on summer evenings, when the light lingered long over the gardens, where Frederick had once apologized beneath the roses, Eleanor would sit with her husband on the stone bench and watch their children play, and marvel at the extraordinary journey that had brought them from strangers to soul-mates, from a 1-week notice to a lifetime of love, from invisibility to being seen so completely that Eleanor sometimes wondered how she had ever believed herself capable of surviving without this man who had dismantled her defenses as surely as she had dismantled his.